It's the third round of the Qatar Masters Open 2023 and you can see Magnus Carlsen carefully adjusting all his pieces. He's taking on Muthaiah AL from India, a talented young player who has a rating of 2470 and is inching closer towards becoming a GM. Magnus lost his second round game against Alisher Suleimanov yesterday, and this one is a big game for him because he cannot afford another loss. He opens the game with 1 e4, e5 and now brings out his knight to f3. What is Muthaiah going to do? Is he going to play the most popular move in this position, knight to c6? No, he goes knight f6. This is the Petroff defense, and this is not going to be an easy nut to crack for Magnus because this is one of the most solid openings in the world of chess. Knight takes e5 played by Magnus. He snatches the pawn in the center, and of course one of the biggest traps in the chess world is if you take the pawn, there is queen e2. So at the top level always everyone plays d6, knight goes back to f3, and now Muthaiah can safely snatch the pawn on e4. Let's see what Magnus goes for. The main move here in this position is to push your pawn to d4 and grab space in the center. But Magnus pushes his pawn just one square. And this is an opening that Magnus has championed. He played this at the recent Speed Chess Championship against Jan Nepomniachtchi, who is a big expert at the Petroff. And now you push the pawn another square. You don't want the knight to be on e4. You want it back on f6. So that's the point. Now the main move here is to gain space back in the center with d5. But Muthaiah plays g6. This is not played much often, but there are games here. In fact, Magnus Carlsen himself has played a game with white pieces against Ivan Šarić here. It also continued bishop d3. Now, one of the problems that Black faces in this position is slight lack of space. That's the only thing. Otherwise, this bishop is actually well positioned, on this diagonal. Bishop g7 played, and now Magnus thinking about what his next move ought to be. I think short castle makes complete sense. Yes, he castles it out, and also Black would really want to castle because rook e1 check is being threatened here to the Black king. You can see that Magnus is tremendously focused on the board. Muthaiah has 1 hour 23 minutes now. He's taken up 7 minutes in the opening, which means he's not particularly super well prepared. h3 played. This is played against the bishop here because Black, having less space, would love to get more pieces of the board by moving his bishop to g4. And Magnus stops it, so now Muthaiah wants to get his bishop on this diagonal. However, that diagonal is not going to be easy as Magnus plays c4, and his point is that later when bishop comes here, he wants to block it with pushing his pawn one square forward. Well, Muthaiah anyway goes bishop to b7. He says to Magnus that, well, you could block me, but I can fight back with my own pawn there. So bishop b7 has been played. Now Magnus develops his pieces. It's quite simple, the openings at top level. You control the center, bring out your pieces, and that's exactly what Magnus is doing here. Rook comes to the open file. That's a good move. If Black is successful in trading pieces, he would be doing well here because he's low on space. But for the time being, it's not so easy. Bishop comes out to e3. Not particularly a great square for the bishop, but it's now come up. The queen can move upwards and the rooks can get connected. Muthaiah also finishes his development by playing knight to d7. How is Magnus going to proceed here? It's a question. He plays rook e1. That's a nice little move because in a way here, what is Black going to do next is a big question. Is he going to try? He would love to trade pieces with knight e4 here. Like put the knight here. However, after takes, and bishop g5, it's lost. White is completely winning. So that's the reason why you can't play that. And he plays his pawn to h6. Maybe now he has this idea of playing knight e4. So Magnus shuts down the position. He plays pawn to d5, and now Muthaiah is worried a bit about his bishop, on b7. What should he do about it? However, he's got one square for his knight. Exactly, the knight jumps to c5 and tells Magnus that you close one thing but you open another. And now the bishop goes back. But I think it's possible now to start trading off pieces on e4. That could be a possibility to move your knight here, get a couple of pieces off the board. But black plays his pawn to c6. And with this move, what black is intending to do is blast open the position even at the cost of a weakness on d6. Magnus comes queen d2. He doesn't even worry about taking this pawn or anything. He's attacking the pawn on h6. A natural move is to play king h7, but first Muthaiah takes the pawn on d5, which is logical, and Magnus would take back. He also takes back in the center, and now king h7 makes a lot of sense. Just put your king there, defend the pawn, everything looks great. But no, he goes knight e4. Whoa, that is now concrete play, and you're taking on the best player in the world, trying to outwit him in calculations. Let's see how that goes. Knight takes knight. Okay, you're going to take back with the knight. That is for sure. Muthaiah now takes with the knight, attacks the queen. So the knight also has to go. Bishop takes. And isn't the pawn hanging on the side of the board? Well, bishop takes e4, and now the rook will swoop in and take this pawn, take this bishop. Yes, he takes. Now, Magnus has to make a decision. If he takes this pawn, bishop takes, queen takes, the queen will be slightly offside and he will lose his central pawn, but Magnus is okay with it. He takes on h6. Of course, first the rook is hanging, so you need to kind of save it. So rook takes e1 first. Yes, rook takes e1, and now he's planning to take the bishop on h6. I think that's important. Yes, he takes, deflecting the queen from the defense of the central pawn, and now you can just snatch the pawn in the center. Bishop takes on d5. That is exactly what Muthaiah does. Yes, he takes on d5. Now, important moment in the game. The knight is being attacked, and there's a fantastic move that Magnus can play, which is knight h2 with the idea of going here. Here's a nice variation. Knight g4 takes here, and you can block the rook here to give this check. But Magnus actually does not go knight h2. He plays his knight to the center, and this is not a great square for the knight, because now Muthaiah plays a fantastic move, queen f6. This is a very logical move, and all of a sudden black's pieces are coordinating pretty well. Now the queen is well placed, the bishop is right in the center. So Magnus comes back with his queen. Can you get greedy and take this pawn is the question. Not really. After pawn to b3, the bishop is trapped and it's going to be taken off. So first Muthaiah brings his rook. Again, great play by the Indian IM. He brings his rook to the c file. How is Magnus going to react? Well, he plays pawn to a3. Interesting decision here by Magnus, because now he doesn't have to worry about this pawn being lost. a6. Muthaiah also doesn't want to worry about the knight jumping to the b5 square and attacking those pawns, and that's why he stops it with his pawn coming forward. And now this next move by Magnus shows his pure sense of harmony when it comes to chess. Rook e3. I really love this move, because with this, his idea is to bring his knight to e2 and eventually to c3. The rook can come to d3 and pressurize d6. With one move, he's actually killing many birds. Now, king g7, you can go knight e2, and Magnus very likely to do that. Yes, knight comes back to e2, and what a nice reshuffling that's going on here by Magnus Carlsen, showing his class. The bishop is hanging, so Muthaiah goes bishop c4, another nice little move, because now if you go knight c3 as planned, Black goes d5, very strong move, threatening d4, and if you take here, I take, and the b2 pawn is hanging. So that's the reason why Magnus now decides to go to g3, which is again a good move. White is clearly better because the bishop really is not as superior as the knight in this position. So Muthaiah goes d5, and now Magnus has a very strong move, rook f3. The point to note here is that after queen e5, there's this killer move, knight f5, takes, check, oops, not the check, rook g, queen g5 check, king f8 and check, and there is this problem. But what Magnus does is he plays b3. Now this is not a good move because Magnus is forcing the bishop to move back and the rook opens up, and you can see that in the same variation, if we go down the line in this exact same thing, check, king e, there cannot be rook e3 because this is a checkmate, and that's the subtle point because of which now Muthaiah is doing fine again. Bishop d7, so Magnus has actually missed his chance to play this move, rook f3, and now black is back in the game. Again, you can't really be taking these pawns because check here, bishop e6, black gets very active. So knight e2 played back, Magnus wants to get his knight to d4. Yes, statically it does seem that white is better, but black is completely back in the game. Bishop e6 played here, which is a decent move, defending the pawn. Muthaiah, what a fighter he is. He was worse right out of the opening, but this is move number 31 and he's still doing pretty well. Knight comes to d4, attacking the bishop. Well, do you want to really move the bishop because knight takes, pawn takes, that seems to be okay for black. Well, not really, he doesn't move it and plays his pawn to a5. Of course, Magnus must not trade too many pieces. This would be slightly better for white, but not that much. And so Magnus now starts to move around, and you know, he plays his king to h2. Maybe he's hoping that at some point he can start to push his pawns on the king side. Check comes in by Muthaiah. He says to Magnus, well, do you want to go back with your king, or if you're going to push the pawn here, your king will get a bit weakened. But I think Magnus has to do it. He plays his pawn to g3. And now Muthaiah's point here is that he just goes back with his queen. Yes, he goes queen f6. How is white going to make progress? And these are the moments why we love watching Magnus's games, because we learn how he manages to outwit his opponents. King g2, but Muthaiah is not going to back down so easily. King has come to g2, and now what do you do here as black? I like this move, bishop d7. Well, the bishop looks a bit passive. That's true, but it also controls all the squares that the knight can move to forward. Well, Magnus goes g4, and with this move, Magnus does weaken the dark squares in the position, but it could be useful in the future. Rook e8, he offers a trade of rook. Again, a fine move by Muthaiah. Magnus has a choice between moving his rook sideways or exchanging. He takes, bishop takes, and now we come to an endgame where Capablanca used to say that white can claim a small edge because a queen and knight function better than a queen and bishop. That's what Jose Raul Capablanca, the third world champion, used to think. And his logic was that the queen can move diagonally and straight, and the knight can move in L shapes, while the queen and bishop move in similar ways. But this theorem, of course, which was accepted widely before with the engines, maybe not so clear. Now just queen d6, queen e6, all are fine moves, but he goes bishop c6, and this is not a good move. Of course, he doesn't want, he's prepared this, that now this knight is lost. But what Magnus does here, he goes g5 and tells Muthaiah, what's your plan, my friend? Because now your queen is attacked, you need to move it. Queen d6 played, and now the queen is not attacking the knight. And we've reached move number 40. So Magnus just goes and grabs a bite, comes back and now starts to think. And he chops off the pawn on b6 after 6 minutes of thought. And this was a very critical moment because now Muthaiah needs to prove his compensation. Why did he give the pawn? Well, he gave it because he wants to open up this bishop here. If queen takes d4, you simply lose the queen because the knight is pinned. But what a nice move by Magnus, king f1. And look at this beauty and subtlety you can't take here. And the next move, if let's say you push here, I go take, and my king is very, very close to the pawn and I win. So that's why king f1 was important. He goes king g8. Magnus now snatches the pawn. Very important for Muthaiah to go back. Queen e7, because knight e5 is met with takes. Here you give a check and pick up the knight, but no, he goes queen e6. He plays this, and this is a mistake. Will Magnus spot it? The reason why this is a mistake is because knight e5 is an unbelievably strong central move. Magnus goes knight e5. Fantastic chess there. He finds it. It's very tough to face Magnus in such technical endgames. He is able to calculate. He's able to find the best moves. Muthaiah says, thank you for the free pawn there. But Magnus now simply moves his king into the center. Now the bishop is hanging. And you will see that the queen and knight coordinate so beautifully to launch an attack against the king. First comes a check, which means that the bishop is now protected. Black is still a pawn down, but he seems to be having counterplay here. So the king has to move up. King d2 played by Magnus Carlsen. Now there are no more checks on the board. And black goes bishop to f3. Interesting, because if you take here, then black can hold this endgame perhaps. This is fine. Also the threat now is to give checks from here and hassle the white king. But Magnus goes knight d7. What a classy move by Magnus. He's just fearless. He sees there's a check, I can move up. There's another check, I can move up. There are no more checks. And also after a check, if you trade queens, that's just a lost endgame because the knight is way superior to the bishop and you're a pawn up. So he gives a check. But now king e3, and you will see that there's nothing much to do because now knight is coming in with a check here and it's launching a decisive attack against the king. Well, Muthaiah says, thank you, I can get a free pawn here. That's a good news for him. But that's all. King f4, and now the queen cannot give any more checks. The bishop is also very loosely positioned. Knight f6 is coming up. So he goes bishop c6. Makes sense here. But guys, now Capablanca would be very, very happy because this is what he was always talking about. The knight and queen coordinate beautifully to launch an attack. If king here, there's already a check. King g7 is met with queen g8 mate. So he goes king g7. But now it's time for a double check there. Knight to h5 or knight to e8. I think both moves look pretty interesting. Magnus plays knight h5. Of course, he's seen the end of this game. Now, if king h7, there is queen g7 mate. The queen is coming in. Even if king g8, there is queen g7. So the only move is to run away with your king. And Muthaiah is hoping that somehow he can survive this attack. He goes king f8. And now if you give a check, the king escapes. If you give a check from here, the bishop blocks. But there is one move that finishes it off very smoothly. And you can see Magnus just making sure, even a player of his caliber needs to be sure. Check here, if king e8, there is knight f6 mate. So you have to go perhaps king g8. But then after queen d8, it is over. He goes king g8. But now Magnus, final move there. And it is all over. He goes queen d8 check. If king h7, there is knight f6 check. And it is checkmate time. A beautiful game here. Great defense by Muthaiah. But finally, he has to yield to the world number one. Magnus Carlsen wins. And he played really well. And you can see he's analyzing there. Let's listen to what they are saying.